I left from home and joined a gang when fighting for the territory friends died. The boss was, and now there's no way out. Growing up, I never really understood why I was different. My name's Jake, by the way. Jake Miller. I was just a regular kid in a regular town. But for some reason, the other kids' parents hated me. I mean, really hated me. And their hate wasn't just about avoiding me or telling their kids not to hang out with me. It went way beyond that. I think it started when I was about 7 or 8. I was in 2nd grade, and we had just moved to this small town in Ohio. My mom, Laura, was a single mom, and I never knew my dad. She never talked about him, and honestly, I never asked. It was just the two of us, and we were doing okay. She worked 2 jobs, one as a waitress at a diner and another cleaning houses. We didn't have much, but we got by. My first day at school was fine, at least until recess. I remember trying to join a game of tag with some other kids, but they just stared at me like I had 2 heads. I brushed it off, thinking maybe they were just shy or something. But then I heard one of the kids, Tyler, whisper to another, "That's him. That's the one my mom said not to play with." I didn't get it. Why wouldn't they want to play with me? I hadn't done anything wrong. I went home that day feeling confused, but I didn't tell my mom. She had enough on her plate, and I didn't want to add to her worries. The next day was worse. I tried to sit with some kids at lunch, but they got up and moved to another table. When I asked one of them, a girl named Emily, why they wouldn't sit with me, she just looked scared and said, "My mom said you're bad news." Bad news? Me? I was just a kid. What could I have possibly done to deserve that? It wasn't long before the whispers turned into outright bullying. The kids would trip me in the hallways, call me names, and throw things at me when the teacher wasn't looking. And the teachers, they didn't help. If anything, they seemed to ignore what was happening, or they'd blame me for causing trouble. It was like I was the problem, but no one would tell me what I'd done wrong. Then one day things escalated. It was after school, and I was walking home alone. We lived in a small house on the outskirts of town, about a mile from the school. I usually walked because Mom was working late, and we couldn't afford after-school care. Anyway, as I was walking, I noticed a group of kids following me. I recognized them, Tyler, Emily, and a few others who had been giving me a hard time at school. At first, I thought maybe they just lived in the same direction, but then they started shouting at me, calling me names. Loser! Freak! Go back to where you came from! I tried to ignore them, but then Tyler threw a rock at me. It hit me in the back of the head, and I fell to the ground. Before I could get up, they were all on me, kicking and punching. I screamed for help, but no one was around. I thought I was going to die right there on the side of the road. A car pulled up. It was Mrs. Anderson, Emily's mom. She got out of the car and ran over, pulling the kids off me. For a second, I thought she was going to help me, that she'd take me to the hospital or call the police. But instead, she looked down at me with this cold, hateful expression and said, "Stay away from my daughter, you little bastard." She didn't care that I was bleeding, that her own daughter had just helped beat me up. She just got back in her car and drove off, taking the kids with her. I dragged myself home that day, limping and crying, not understanding why this was happening to me. I didn't tell my mom what happened. I didn't want her to worry. But the bruises were hard to hide, and eventually she noticed. When she asked me about it, I lied and said I fell off my bike. She seemed to believe me, or maybe she just didn't want to push. We didn't talk about feelings much in our house, but that wasn't the worst of it. The worst came a few weeks later. There was a school field trip to the local zoo. I didn't want to go, but my mom insisted. She thought it would be good for me to get out, to have some fun. I wasn't so sure, but I went anyway. I stuck to myself most of the day, trying to avoid the other kids. But near the end of the trip, we went to see the lions. The other kids were all gathered around the enclosure, laughing and pointing. But I stayed back, not wanting to get too close. That's when I noticed Mrs. Anderson again. She was one of the parent chaperones, and she was watching me, not the lions. I tried to ignore her, but then she walked over and said, "You know, Jake, some people think it would be better if you just disappeared." I was stunned. I didn't know what to say. What kind of adult says something like that to a kid? Before I could respond, she grabbed my arm and started pulling me toward the lion enclosure. At first, I thought she was just going to yell at me some more. But then she did something I'll never forget. She shoved me toward the fence, hard enough that I stumbled and almost fell into the enclosure. The lions were right there, just a few feet away, and for a moment, I thought I was going to die. But then she pulled me back, laughing quietly, and whispered, "Next time, you might not be so lucky." I was terrified. I ran away, hiding in the bathroom until it was time to go home. I never told anyone what she did. Who would believe me? I was just a kid and she was an adult, a well-respected parent in the community. It was her word against mine. The bullying continued after that. But it wasn't just the kids anymore. It was their parents too. They'd glare at me in the grocery store, whisper to each other when I walked by. I even overheard one of them telling my mom that we should move, that people like us weren't welcome in their town. My mom didn't understand what was happening either. She tried to make friends with the other moms, but they all kept their distance. I think she started to realize something was wrong when one of her clients, Mrs. Reynolds, suddenly stopped hiring her to clean their house. Mom asked her why, and Mrs. Reynolds just said, "We don't want your kind around here." Our kind? What did that even mean? We weren't different. We weren't criminals or troublemakers. We were just us. But it didn't matter. The more the parents hated me, the more their kids did too. And it wasn't just verbal abuse anymore. One day, they trashed my locker, dumping paint all over my books and writing "freak" in big letters on the inside of the door. Another time, they put glue on my chair, so when I sat down, my pants got stuck, and I had to go home in shame. But the worst was the fire. It happened during the summer before 5th grade. We lived in a small house, like I said, and it was nothing fancy, but it was home. My mom worked so hard to keep it, to give us a place where we could be safe. But that safety was shattered one night when I woke up to the smell of smoke. I remember panicking, not knowing what was going on. The smoke was thick, and I could barely see. I ran to my mom's room, screaming for her to wake up. We both rushed outside, and that's when we saw it. Our house was on fire. Flames were pouring out of the windows, and the roof was already caving in. The fire department came, but it was too late. Everything was gone. Our clothes, our photos, everything. We were left with nothing but the clothes on our backs. The fire chief told us it was probably an electrical problem, but I knew better. I knew who had done it. And I think my mom knew too, but she didn't say anything. We both just stood there, watching our home burn, knowing we'd never be safe in that town again. We left Ohio after that. My mom scraped together what little money we had left, and we moved to a different state, far away from the people who hated us. We tried to start over, but the damage was done. I never went back to school after that. I was too scared, too traumatized by what had happened. My mom tried to homeschool me, but it wasn't the same. I was too broken to learn, too scared to trust anyone ever again. I grew up feeling like an outsider, like I didn't belong anywhere. I never made friends, never had a normal childhood. The hatred those parents had for me, for no reason I could ever understand, left scars that still haven't healed. After the fire that destroyed our home, my mom and I packed up what little we had left and moved out of Ohio. We ended up in a rundown apartment in a gritty part of a city that wasn't much better than where we'd come from. The place was cheap, and that was about the only good thing I could say about it. The walls were thin, the neighbors were loud, and the streets were filled with people who looked like they'd lost everything a long time ago. Mom did her best to keep us going. She picked up another job at a diner nearby and tried to keep things as normal as possible, but we were both hanging on by a thread. I was still haunted by what had happened back in Ohio, by the hate I'd faced from people I didn't even know. It didn't take long before I started skipping out on the homeschooling lessons Mom tried to set up for me. I'd wander the streets instead, trying to clear my head, trying to make sense of everything. The streets around our new place were nothing like the quiet, tree-lined roads of our old town. They were dirty, cracked, and filled with abandoned buildings that looked like they were about to collapse any second. There were people, sure, but they were mostly old men sitting on the steps of their crumbling houses, staring off into space like they were waiting for something that was never going to come. I was alone, even when I was surrounded by people. I didn't talk to anyone, and no one talked to me. At first, I stuck to the main roads, where there were at least some signs of life. But as time went on, I started exploring the side streets, the alleys, the places that normal people avoided. I guess I was looking for something, maybe trouble, maybe just a distraction from the pain that was gnawing away at me from the inside. That's how I met him, the guy who would change everything. It was late one afternoon, and I was walking down an alley I hadn't been in before. The buildings on either side were tall and dark, casting long shadows that made the whole place feel like a different world. I was just about to turn back when I heard a noise, a low, gravelly voice talking, but I couldn't make out the words. I followed the sound, and that's when I saw him. He was older, probably in his late 30s or early 40s, though the deep lines on his face made him look even older. He had a rough, rugged appearance, with a thick beard and a scar running down the side of his cheek. His clothes were worn, but there was something about the way he carried himself that told me he wasn't someone to mess with. There was a coldness in his eyes, a look that sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know it then, but this was Viper, the leader of a small gang that operated in the shadows of the city. He was the kind of guy who'd been through hell and back, and he wore it like a badge of honor. He saw me standing there, staring at him like some dumb kid, and instead of yelling at me to get lost, he just gave me a once-over and then went back to whatever he was doing. I don't know what possessed me to approach him. Maybe it was the fact that he didn't treat me like I was invisible, like everyone else did. Or maybe it was that, in some twisted way, I felt like I belonged there in that dark alley with him. Either way, I stepped closer, and before I knew it, I was standing right in front of him. For a while, I just watched him. He didn't seem to care, didn't tell me to leave or ask what I wanted. He was fiddling with something, a knife, I think, sharpening it with this calm, methodical precision. He asked me what I was doing there, in a voice that was more curious than anything else. I didn't have a good answer, so I just shrugged and said I didn't know. He looked at me for a long moment, like he was sizing me up, trying to figure out if I was worth his time. Then he asked me where I lived, who I was. I told him about the fire, about my mom, about how we ended up here with nothing. For some reason, Viper seemed to take an interest in my story. Maybe he saw something in me, some kind of potential, or maybe just a kid who was lost and broken like he had been once. Whatever it was, he didn't send me away. Instead, he started talking to me, telling me about the city, about how things really worked. He told me that the streets weren't just for walking, that there were people out there who made their living off of them. People who didn't follow the rules but still survived. That was my introduction to the gang. Viper's gang wasn't big, just 5 guys, all older than me, all tough as nails. There was Rex, a massive guy with arms like tree trunks, who was Viper's right-hand man. He had a deep voice that rumbled like thunder and a laugh that could make your skin crawl. Then there was Slim, a wiry dude with a constant smirk on his face and quick hands that could pick a pocket before you even knew what was happening. Tank was the youngest of the group, probably in his mid-20s, and he was the muscle, the guy they sent in when things needed to get physical. Last was Doc, the oldest of the bunch, and the one who patched everyone up when things went south. He wasn't a real doctor, of course, but he knew enough to keep the gang on their feet. At first, I was just an outsider, a kid hanging around the edges, watching and listening. They didn't let me in on anything important, didn't trust me with anything that mattered. But they didn't push me away either. Viper seemed to have made it clear that I was under his protection, so they tolerated me, even if they didn't like it. I guess I was like a stray dog they'd picked up off the street, more of a nuisance than anything else, but not worth the trouble of getting rid of. Over time, though, things started to change. I think it was because I was so desperate to prove myself, so eager to be a part of something, anything. I started running errands for them, nothing big at first, just carrying messages, keeping lookout, that sort of thing. But even that was enough to make me feel like I was part of the group, like I belonged somewhere for the first time in my life. The more I did for them, the more they trusted me. They started calling me by a nickname, Kid, which wasn't exactly original, but it felt like an initiation of sorts. And with every small task I completed, I got deeper and deeper into their world. Viper took a particular interest in me. He'd take me aside sometimes and talk to me, telling me about his life, about how he'd ended up as the leader of this ragtag group of outcasts. He'd grown up in the city, just like me, but he'd never had a family, never had anyone who cared about him. He'd been in and out of trouble since he was a teenager, and by the time he was in his 20s, he was running with a gang twice as big as the one he had now. But that gang had fallen apart, most of the guys either dead or in prison, and Viper had been left to pick up the pieces. He told me that he'd learned early on that you couldn't rely on anyone but yourself. That trust was something you had to earn, and even then, it could be taken away in an instant. But he also told me that, despite everything, there was a kind of loyalty among people like him, a loyalty that was stronger than anything you could find in the so-called normal world. I soaked up everything he said like a sponge. I didn't have a father figure, and in a weird, twisted way, Viper started to fill that role. I looked up to him, admired the way he took control, the way he seemed to know everything there was to know about surviving in a world that had chewed him up and spit him out. I wanted to be like him, to earn his respect, to prove that I wasn't just some lost kid who had wandered into his life by accident. So I did whatever they asked of me. I started getting involved in their jobs, small-time robberies at first, nothing too risky. Viper never let me do anything dangerous, at least not in the beginning. He said I had to earn my place, that I had to prove I wasn't a liability, and I did. I learned how to break into cars, how to pick locks, how to disappear into the shadows when things got too hot. I wasn't as big or as strong as Rex, or as quick as Slim, but I was smart, and I learned fast. I started to change too. The scared, lonely kid who had been bullied and beaten down was disappearing, replaced by someone harder, someone who didn't care as much about right and wrong. I stopped thinking about what my mom would say, about how she'd raised me to be a good person. The gang became my family, and I wanted nothing more than to prove myself to them. As the months went by, I got more involved in their operations. Viper started to trust me with bigger jobs, letting me plan some of the smaller heists. I think he saw something in me, a potential that maybe even I didn't know I had. I was becoming a part of the gang, not just in name, but in spirit. They started calling me Ghost, because I had this knack for slipping in and out of places without being seen, for leaving no trace behind. It wasn't long before I was doing things I never thought I'd do, breaking into houses, robbing stores, even stealing cars. And I was good at it. Too good. The thrill of it, the rush of adrenaline when we pulled off a job, it was addictive. It made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. And the guys, they started to respect me. I wasn't just kid anymore. I was one of them. But with every job, with every risk I took, a part of me knew that I was losing something important. I was losing myself, the person I used to be. I'd look in the mirror sometimes and barely recognize the face staring back at me. I was harder, colder, and I wasn't sure if I liked what I was becoming, but I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop, because as messed up as it was, the gang was the only family I had, the only place I felt like I belonged. Viper noticed the change in me too. He started talking to me more, sharing more of his plans, his vision for the gang. He told me that he saw potential in me, that I could be more than just a foot soldier, that I could be a leader someday. That idea got under my skin, and I started thinking about what it would be like to run the gang, to have that kind of power, that kind of control. But the deeper I got, the more dangerous things became. We weren't just pulling off small-time jobs anymore. Viper had bigger plans, riskier plans. He wanted to expand, to take over more territory, to make a name for ourselves in the city. And I was right there with him, ready to do whatever it took to make that happen. The other guys in the gang, Rex, Slim, Tank, and Doc, they all started to see me differently too. They stopped treating me like the kid who had just wandered in off the street and started treating me like an equal. They started to listen to me, to respect my opinions, to trust me with more responsibility. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was in control, like I was making something of myself, even if that something was dark and twisted. But with that respect came more pressure, more danger. Viper's plans were getting more ambitious, more reckless, and as much as I wanted to prove myself, to show that I could handle anything he threw at me, there was a part of me that started to worry. I could feel the tension in the gang, the way things were shifting, getting more dangerous, more unstable. The jobs were getting riskier, the stakes higher, and I knew that it was only a matter of time before something went wrong. And I was right, but that's a story for another time. For now, I'll just say this. Be careful what you wish for, because sometimes, when you get what you want, you lose everything else in the process. It started on a rainy night, the kind where the sky feels like it's pressing down on you, heavy and suffocating. I was out on one of my usual walks, trying to clear my head after a long day. The gang had been on edge lately, and I couldn't shake this feeling of unease that had settled in my gut. Viper had been planning something big, something that could either put us on the map or get us all killed. I was cutting through an alley on the way back to the warehouse where we all hung out when I heard voices, angry, heated. I recognized one of them right away. It was Slim. The other voice was deeper, rougher, and unfamiliar. I slowed down, sticking to the shadows, trying to get a sense of what was going on. As I got closer, I could make out their words. "I told you, Slim. You don't mess with us. You should have known better. Come on, man. It was just a misunderstanding. We didn't mean any disrespect." There was a pause and then a laugh, cold and cruel. "Disrespect? Nah, Slim. This isn't about disrespect. This is about making sure everyone knows who runs this city. And you just made a big mistake." I peered around the corner and saw Slim backed up against the wall, facing three guys I didn't recognize. The one in the middle was clearly the leader. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a shaved head and a face that looked like it had seen one too many fights. The other two were just as rough-looking, and they were blocking any chance Slim had of getting away. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized what was about to happen. Slim was outnumbered, and there was no way he was going to talk his way out of this. Before I could think, I was moving, stepping out of the shadows and into the alley. "Hey!" I shouted, drawing their attention. "Leave him alone." The leader turned to me, a sneer on his face. "And who the hell are you?" "Doesn't matter," I said, trying to sound tougher than I felt. "Just let him go. We don't want any trouble." The guy stared at me for a long moment, sizing me up. Finally, he nodded to the guys on either side of him. "You heard the kid," he said. "Let's get out of here." For a second, I thought we were in the clear. But then, just as they started to turn away, the leader swung around and punched Slim in the stomach, hard. Slim doubled over, gasping for breath, and before I could react, the other two were on him, kicking and punching, their faces twisted with anger and something darker, something like enjoyment. I rushed forward, trying to pull them off, but the leader grabbed me and threw me against the wall. I hit the bricks hard, pain exploding through my shoulder. I tried to get up, but he was on me, holding me down with a knee to my chest. I could barely breathe, let alone fight back. "You should have stayed out of this, kid," he growled, his face inches from mine. "Now you're gonna pay for it." I didn't see the knife until it was too late. The blade flashed in the dim light, and I felt a sharp, searing pain in my side. I gasped, the world spinning around me as the pain spread, hot and suffocating. The leader leaned in closer, his voice low and menacing. "Remember this, Ghost," he hissed, using the nickname the gang had given me. "Next time, stay out of our business." He pulled the knife out, and I cried out in pain, clutching my side as blood started to seep through my fingers. The leader stood up, wiping the blade on his shirt before tucking it back into his belt. He looked down at me one last time, a smirk on his face, then turned and walked away, his goons following close behind. I lay there gasping for breath, my vision swimming as I tried to process what had just happened. Slim was beside me, groaning in pain, his face bruised and bloodied. Somehow, I managed to pull myself up, leaning against the wall for support. I pressed my hand against my side, trying to slow the bleeding, but I knew it was bad. I needed help, fast. With what little strength I had left, I helped Slim to his feet, and together we stumbled out of the alley. The rain was pouring down now, cold and relentless, washing away the blood that dripped from my side. I could barely see, the world a blur of darkness and pain, but I knew we had to keep moving. We had to get back to the warehouse, back to Viper and the others. We finally made it, collapsing just inside the door. Rex was the first to see us, his eyes widening in shock as he rushed over. "What the hell happened?" he demanded, kneeling beside me as I slumped to the floor. "Got jumped," I gasped, the words barely making it past my lips. "Three guys, didn't see it coming." Viper was there a second later, his face a mask of cold fury. He took one look at me, at the blood soaking through my shirt, and barked orders to Doc. "Get him patched up now." Doc moved quickly, his hands steady as he examined the wound. "We need to stop the bleeding," he muttered, ripping a piece of cloth from his shirt and pressing it against my side. I cried out in pain, the world spinning as darkness crept. "Stay with us, Ghost," Viper said, his voice low and urgent. "Don't you dare check out on me now." I nodded weakly, fighting to stay conscious as Doc worked. The pain was overwhelming, a constant throb that made it hard to think, hard to breathe. But I knew I couldn't pass out, couldn't let go, not yet. After what felt like an eternity, the bleeding finally slowed, and Doc bandaged me up as best he could. "He needs a hospital," he said quietly, looking up at Viper. "No hospitals," Viper snapped. "We can't risk it. Get him to the safe house." Rex and Tank helped me to my feet, half carrying me out of the warehouse and into a car. The ride was a blur of pain and darkness, my mind drifting in and out as they drove. I don't remember much of what happened after that, just flashes of light, of voices, of hands on me, trying to keep me alive. When I finally came to, I was lying on a bed in a small, dimly lit room. My side was wrapped in bandages, and the pain had dulled to a deep, throbbing ache. I tried to sit up, but the effort sent a wave of nausea crashing over me, and I collapsed back onto the bed, groaning. Doc was there, sitting in a chair beside the bed, watching me with a concerned expression. "Take it easy, Ghost," he said, his voice soft. "You're lucky to be alive." "What happened?" I asked, my voice hoarse and weak. "You got stabbed, that's what happened," Doc replied, shaking his head. "You lost a lot of blood, but you're tough. You'll pull through." I closed my eyes, the memories of the alley flooding back, the leader's face, the flash of the knife, the pain. It was all too much. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, and I quickly wiped it away, not wanting to show any weakness. "Who were they?" I asked, my voice trembling. Doc sighed, leaning back in his chair. "That's what we're trying to figure out. Viper's got Rex and Tank out looking for answers. Whoever they are, they messed with the wrong gang." The next few days were a blur of pain and frustration. I was stuck in that small room, unable to move without feeling like I was being torn apart from the inside. Viper came by a few times, checking in on me, but he was always in and out, busy with something else. The tension in the air was palpable, like a storm was brewing just outside the walls, waiting to break. It wasn't long before I found out what was going on. Viper had gotten word that the guys who attacked Slim and me were from a rival gang, the Bloodhounds. They were new to the city, but they were making a name for themselves fast. Word on the street was that they were looking to expand their territory, and they didn't care who they had to go through to do it. Viper was furious. He saw the attack on us as a declaration of war, and he wasn't about to let it slide. But Viper wasn't the type to rush into things without a plan. He spent the next few days gathering information, figuring out who the key players in the Bloodhounds were, and where they operated. The tension in the gang was building, and I could feel it even from my bed. This wasn't just about protecting our territory anymore. It was about sending a message. As soon as I was strong enough to stand, Viper called a meeting. It was in the back room of the warehouse, a place we used for planning jobs and dealing with sensitive issues. The air was thick with smoke from Viper's ever-present cigarette, and the mood was grim. Rex, Slim, Tank, and Doc were all there, along with a few new faces I hadn't seen before. I later found out they were allies Viper had called in. Guys with names like Brick and Snake, tough-looking men with hardened eyes who had seen their fair share of fights. Viper laid it all out for us. The Bloodhounds had moved into our turf without permission, and they'd attacked our own. That was something Viper couldn't let slide. He explained that he'd already scouted their main hangout, an old, abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. It was heavily guarded, but Viper had a plan to hit them where it hurt. The plan was simple, but risky. We were going to infiltrate their base, take out as many of them as we could, and steal a shipment of goods they were planning to move that night. It was a big job, bigger than anything we'd done before. But Viper was confident that if we pulled it off, it would cripple the Bloodhounds and send a clear message to the rest of the city that we weren't to be messed with. As he talked, I could see the resolve in everyone's faces. We all knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about territory or power anymore. It was about survival. If we didn't make a stand now, the Bloodhounds would keep coming until we were wiped out. Viper broke us into teams, each with a specific role to play. I was paired with Slim and Brick. Our job was to breach the factory's main entrance and take out the guards while the others moved in from different sides. It was going to be dangerous, but I was ready. After what had happened in that alley, I wanted revenge just as much as anyone else. The night of the raid was tense. We gathered at the warehouse, checking our gear and going over the plan one last time. Viper was quiet, more focused than I'd ever seen him. As we headed out into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something that would change everything. When we reached the factory, the place was eerily quiet. The only sound was the distant hum of the city and the occasional rustle of the wind. We moved in silently, using the cover of darkness to our advantage. Brick and I took the lead, creeping up to the main entrance where two guards stood, smoking and chatting casually. With a nod from Brick, we made our move. In a flash, Brick had one of the guards in a chokehold, while I took out the other, with a swift punch to the throat. They went down without a sound, and we dragged their bodies into the shadows. The others moved in quickly, fanning out to cover the different entrances. Viper had the timing down to a science. We all knew exactly what to do and when to do it. As soon as the guards were down, we breached the factory, spreading out into the dark, cavernous space. Inside, the factory was a maze of rusted machinery and crumbling walls. The bloodhounds had set up shop in the main assembly area, where a few dim lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. There were more of them than we'd anticipated. At least 20 or 30, all armed and ready for trouble, but Viper wasn't deterred. He signaled for us to move in, and chaos erupted. Gunfire echoed through the factory as we clashed with the bloodhounds. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of gunpowder, and the sounds of shouting and bullets whizzing by filled my ears. It was a brutal close-quarters fight, with no room for hesitation or mercy. I stuck close to Slim and Brick, the three of us working together to take down anyone who got in our way. Slim was quick and agile, darting between cover and taking out enemies with deadly precision. Brick, true to his name, was a powerhouse. He mowed down anyone who came at us with sheer brute force. But it wasn't easy. The bloodhounds were tough, and they fought back hard. At one point, I found myself in a hand-to-hand struggle with a guy twice my size, his fists pounding into me like sledgehammers. But I fought back with everything I had, using every dirty trick Viper had taught me, until I finally managed to get the upper hand and take him down. Despite the chaos, we managed to push through to the main assembly area, where the shipment was being held. It was a stash of drugs, weapons, and cash, everything the bloodhounds had been planning to move that night. Viper's plan was to take it all and cripple them financially, leaving them with nothing to fight back with. But just as we were securing the shipment, things took a turn for the worse. From out of nowhere, reinforcements arrived, a second wave of bloodhounds, at least a dozen more, bursting into the factory from a side entrance we hadn't accounted for. They came at us hard, and suddenly the odds were stacked against us. The fight intensified, the factory echoing with the sounds of gunfire and screams. I saw Brick go down, a bullet tearing through his leg, and I rushed to help him, dragging him behind cover as he clutched at the wound, cursing in pain. Slim was still in the thick of it, but I could see the strain on his face, the desperation as we were pushed back, outnumbered and outgunned. Viper was shouting orders, trying to keep us together, but the bloodhounds were relentless. And then, in the midst of the chaos, I saw him, the leader of the bloodhounds, the same guy who had stabbed me in that alley. He was moving through the fight like a predator, picking off our guys one by one, a twisted grin on his face. When our eyes met, I felt a surge of anger and fear, but also a burning need for revenge. I broke cover and charged at him, ignoring the shouts from Viper and the others. I was consumed by the need to take him down, to make him pay for what he'd done. He saw me coming, and his grin widened, like he was looking forward to finishing what he'd started. We clashed in the middle of the factory, fists and knives flashing in the dim light. He was strong, stronger than I'd anticipated, but I fought with everything I had, fueled by anger and desperation. The fight was brutal, each of us landing blow after blow, blood and sweat mixing on the dirty floor. At one point, he managed to knock the knife from my hand, sending it skittering across the floor. He lunged at me, his own knife aimed at my throat, but I grabbed his wrist, struggling to keep the blade away. We grappled, the knife inching closer and closer until I finally managed to twist his arm, forcing him to drop the weapon. But he didn't give up. He slammed his fist into my side, right where he'd stabbed me before, and the pain was blinding. I stumbled back, gasping for breath, and he tackled me, sending us both crashing to the ground. We rolled across the floor, each trying to get the upper hand, but he was relentless, a vicious, snarling force that seemed unstoppable. I could feel my strength waning, the fight draining out of me, and I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. And then, Just as I thought I was done for, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A glint of metal, the knife I'd dropped earlier. It was just out of reach, but I had to try. With one final burst of energy, I twisted away from him, diving for the knife. He lunged after me, but I was faster. My fingers closed around the handle, and I swung the blade up just as he came at me. The knife sank into his side, and he froze, his eyes wide with shock and pain. For a moment, everything went still. The noise of the fight faded into the background, and all I could see was the leader's face, his eyes locked on mine as he realized what had happened. And then, with a choked gasp, he collapsed, his body going limp as he fell to the floor. I lay there panting and covered in blood, staring at his lifeless body. The pain in my side was overwhelming, but I forced myself to get up, to push through the agony. The fight wasn't over yet. When I finally got back to my feet, I saw that the tide had turned. With their leader dead, the bloodhounds were starting to retreat, falling back as Viper and the others pressed the attack. The factory was a mess of bodies and blood, the air thick with the stench of death and gunpowder. But we had won. Barely. As the last of the bloodhounds fled, we regrouped, gathering what we could of the shipment. Brick was still alive, though barely, his leg a bloody mess. Slim was battered and bruised, but still on his feet, his face grim and determined. Viper, as always, was in control, barking orders and making sure we moved quickly. The factory was no longer safe. We needed to get out before the cops or more bloodhounds showed up. I limped over to where Brick was lying, his face pale and slick with sweat. Slim was already there, trying to stop the bleeding with whatever he could find. The bullet had gone clean through, but it had done a lot of damage. Brick's leg was a mess, and we knew we had to get him out of there fast. Viper called for Tank and Rex, who had been securing the rest of the factory. They came running, their expressions hard as they took in the scene. Viper didn't waste any time. He ordered them to carry Brick to the van we had stashed a few blocks away. There was no way he could walk on his own, and every second we stayed here increased the risk of getting caught or ambushed. As they lifted Brick, I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the pain from my injuries was starting to catch up. I pressed a hand to my side, feeling the sticky warmth of my own blood seeping through the bandages Doc had put on earlier. I wasn't in great shape, but I wasn't dead, and that was something. We moved out quickly, keeping to the shadows as we made our way back to the van. Every noise, every shadow felt like a potential threat. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting more bloodhounds to come charging out of the darkness. But the streets were empty, the city strangely silent in the aftermath of the fight. When we reached the van, we loaded Brick into the back as carefully as we could. He was slipping in and out of consciousness, his breathing shallow and labored. Doc climbed in with him, already prepping to do what he could to keep Brick stable until we could get him to a safer location. Viper and Slim took the front seats, while Rex, Tank, and I squeezed into the back, trying to keep out of sight. As the van pulled away, I finally let myself relax, if only a little. We'd made it out, but just barely. My whole body ached, and every bump in the road sent a fresh wave of pain through my side. But I was alive, and for now, that was all that mattered. The ride back to our safe house was tense and silent, everyone lost in their own thoughts. The gravity of what we had just done was sinking in, and the adrenaline rush was giving way to exhaustion and pain. I leaned back against the cold metal of the van's interior, trying to focus on breathing through the pain in my side. The night wasn't over yet, but we had survived, and that was something. When we finally arrived at the safe house, a nondescript building in a forgotten part of the city, we unloaded Brick first. Doc and Tank carried him inside, disappearing into one of the back rooms where Doc could work on stabilizing him. The rest of us followed, our steps heavy and slow, weighed down by the events of the night. Inside, the safe house was quiet and dimly lit. It was a place we rarely used, a fallback location for when things got too hot in the city. Viper had set it up years ago, and it was stocked with enough supplies to last us a few days if we needed to lay low. But right now, all I wanted was to collapse and not think about anything for a while. Viper was the last to enter, his expression unreadable as he closed the door behind him. He walked over to the small kitchen area, pouring himself a drink before turning to face us. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the battered and bruised faces of his gang, his family. "Good job tonight," he said, his voice low and steady. "We did what we had to do, and we came out on top. But this isn't over. The bloodhounds are going to come back, and when they do, we need to be ready." No one said anything. We all knew he was right. This was just the beginning of something bigger, something darker. The fight with the bloodhounds was going to escalate, and the city was about to become a war zone. As Viper continued to talk, laying out our next steps, I couldn't help but think about the man I'd killed. His face kept flashing in my mind, the look in his eyes when the knife had gone in. I'd killed before. It was part of the life we led, but this felt different. This felt personal. After Viper finished, everyone drifted off to different parts of the safe house. Rex and Tank went to check on Brick while Slim disappeared into one of the bedrooms, probably to crash for a few hours. I stayed in the main room, staring at the drink Viper had handed me, but not really seeing it. Viper came over and sat down across from me, his expression softer now that we were alone. He took a sip of his drink, watching me closely. "You did good tonight, Ghost," he said after a long silence. "You've got the makings of a leader, you know that?" I didn't respond. I didn't feel like a leader. I felt like a scared kid who'd just barely survived another night in a life I wasn't sure I wanted anymore. Viper sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I know what you're thinking," he said, "that this isn't what you signed up for, that maybe there's another way out." I looked at him, surprised. He'd always been so focused, so certain of the path we were on. Hearing him talk like this was unsettling. "But let me tell you something," he continued. "There's no way out of this life once you're in it. You think those bloodhounds are just going to let you walk away? You think the cops are going to let you live a normal life after everything we've done? No, Ghost. This is it. You're either all in or you're dead." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew he was right, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. I'd chosen this life, and now I had to live with the consequences. Viper must have seen the doubt in my eyes because he leaned forward, his voice softening. "I get it, Ghost. I've been where you are, wondering if it's all worth it. But trust me, it is. We've got something good here, something real, and we're going to take this city one way or another." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The weight of what we were doing, of what I'd become, was pressing down on me, threatening to crush me. But Viper was right. There was no way out. I was in too deep, and there was no turning back. The next few days were a blur of planning and preparation. Viper had a new plan, a way to hit the bloodhounds hard and fast, to take them out before they could retaliate. He was calling in every favor, pulling every string he could to get the manpower and resources we needed. More allies arrived at the safe house. Tough, dangerous men from other parts of the city, all of them loyal to Viper. There was Jack, a wiry guy with a talent for explosives, and Big Mike, a hulking brute who looked like he could crush a man with his bare hands. There was also Raven, a sharp-eyed woman with a sniper rifle slung over her shoulder, who had a reputation for never missing her mark. The safe house was buzzing with activity. Everyone focused on their tasks, preparing for what was to come. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was all spiraling out of control. The fight with the bloodhounds was turning into a full-blown war, and I wasn't sure if any of us were going to make it out alive. Brick was still in bad shape, but he was tough, and Doc had done what he could to patch him up. He was resting in one of the back rooms, and I visited him a few times, trying to offer some kind of comfort. But there wasn't much to say. We both knew the risks, and we both knew that this was far from over. Finally, the night of the big job arrived. Viper had gathered everyone in the main room, going over the plan one last time. The tension was thick in the air, a mixture of excitement and dread. We were about to make our move, and there was no going back. The plan was simple but brutal. We were going to hit the Bloodhounds' main stash house, a heavily fortified building in the heart of their territory. Viper had split us into 3 teams. The first team, led by Rex, would create a diversion at the front of the building, drawing the Bloodhounds' attention. The second team, led by Tank, would breach the side entrance and take out as many of them as possible. My team, led by Viper himself, would enter through a hidden tunnel that Raven had discovered and go straight for the stash. We geared up in silence, the weight of what we were about to do hanging over us. I strapped on my bulletproof vest, checked my weapons, and tried to steady my nerves. The last thing Viper said before we left the safe house was, "Stick to the plan. and we'll all make it out of this. We've come too far to lose now. The drive to the Bloodhounds' territory was tense and quiet. The city seemed almost eerily calm, as if it knew what was about to happen. The van was filled with the sounds of weapons being loaded, of last-minute checks and quiet conversations. I kept to myself, running over the plan in my head, trying to focus on the task at hand. When we arrived, the streets were dark and deserted. The Bloodhounds' stash house loomed ahead of us, a hulking, fortified building surrounded by high walls and barbed wire. It looked like a fortress, and for a moment, I wondered if we were really prepared for what we were about to do. But there was no time for doubt. Viper gave the signal, and we moved out. Rex's team went in first, hitting the front entrance with a barrage of gunfire and explosions. The noise was deafening, shattering the night and drawing the attention of every bloodhound in the area. They responded quickly, returning fire from the windows and the roof, but Rex's team held their ground, keeping the pressure on. Tank's team moved in next, breaching the side entrance with a blast that shook the ground. They poured into the building, engaging the bloodhounds in a fierce firefight. The air was filled with the sounds of gunfire, shouts, and the occasional explosion as they fought their way through the building. Meanwhile, Viper led us to the hidden tunnel, a narrow passage that ran beneath the building and led to a small, unguarded entrance. Raven had found it during one of her scouting missions, and it was our best shot at getting inside without being noticed. The tunnel was dark and cramped, the walls damp and cold. We moved in silence, our footsteps echoing in the confined space. My heart was pounding in my chest, a mixture of fear and adrenaline coursing through my veins. I knew what was waiting for us on the other side, and I knew there was no room for mistakes. When we reached the end of the tunnel, Viper paused, signaling for us to stop. He carefully pushed open the metal grate that covered the entrance, peering out into the dimly lit room beyond. When he was satisfied that it was clear, he motioned for us to follow. We emerged into what looked like a storage room, filled with crates and boxes stacked haphazardly against the walls. The air was thick with the smell of dust and oil, and the only light came from a single flickering bulb overhead. Viper led us through the room, moving quickly and silently. We could hear the sounds of the battle raging above us, gunfire, shouts, and the occasional explosion. But down here, it was eerily quiet. It felt like we were moving through the belly of the beast, each step bringing us closer to the heart of the Bloodhounds' operation. Finally, we reached the door that led to the main stash room. Viper signaled for us to stop, his hand resting on the doorknob. He looked back at us, his expression hard and focused. This was it, the moment we'd been working toward. If we could take this room, the Bloodhounds would be finished. With a nod from Viper, we moved in. The stash room was massive, filled with rows of shelves stacked with money, drugs, and weapons. It was a treasure trove, the lifeblood of the Bloodhounds' operation, but it was also heavily guarded. As soon as we entered, the guards opened fire. The room erupted in chaos, bullets flying as we ducked behind cover, returning fire with everything we had. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of gunpowder, the noise deafening. Viper was in his element, moving with deadly precision as he took out one guard after another. I stayed close to him, trying to cover his back as we fought our way through the room. The Bloodhounds were tough, but we were tougher, and slowly we started to gain the upper hand. But then, just as it seemed like we were going to take the room, something went wrong. One of the guards, a tall, lanky guy with a crazed look in his eyes, managed to get behind us. Before I could react, he lunged at Viper, tackling him to the ground. They struggled, the guard's hands wrapped around Viper's throat, trying to choke the life out of him. I didn't think, I just acted. I raised my gun and fired, the bullet hitting the guard square in the back. He slumped forward, his grip on Viper loosening as he fell to the floor, dead. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Viper gasped for breath, his face pale and strained. I helped him to his feet, but I could see that he was hurt, badly. He tried to hide it, tried to push through, but I could see the pain in his eyes, the way he was struggling to stay on his feet. We had to get out of there, and fast. With the last of the guards down, we moved quickly, grabbing as much of the stash as we could carry. There was no time to take everything. We had to move, and every second we stayed in that room was another second closer to disaster. We made our way back through the storage room and into the tunnel, the weight of the stolen goods slowing us down. Viper was struggling, his steps unsteady, but he refused to stop, refused to give in. He was determined to get out of there, to see this through to the end. When we finally emerged from the tunnel, the sounds of the battle had died down. Rex and Tank's teams had done their job, taking out most of the bloodhounds and securing the building. But it had come at a cost. Several of our guys were down, and the rest were battered and bruised, barely holding it together. We regrouped at the van, loading up the stolen goods as quickly as we could. Viper collapsed into the passenger seat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I climbed into the back, my hands shaking as I tried to process everything that had just happened. As we drove away from the Bloodhounds' territory, the reality of what we'd done began to sink in. We'd won, but at what cost? The city was going to be a war zone now, with the Bloodhounds out for revenge and the cops breathing down our necks. And Viper, the man who had held us all together, was barely holding on. When we finally reached the safe house, everyone was exhausted, running on adrenaline and fear. We unloaded the van in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Viper was taken to one of the back rooms, where Doc could take a look at him. The rest of us gathered in the main room, the weight of what we'd done hanging heavy in the air. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. We'd won the battle, but the war was far from over. And I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much darker, something we weren't prepared for. As I sat there staring at the blood on my hands, I realized that there was no going back. I'd crossed a line and there was no way to undo what I'd done. The life I'd chosen, the life I'd fought so hard to be a part of, had finally consumed me. And I didn't know if I was strong enough to survive what was coming next. But there was no turning back now. The only way out was through, and I was going to have to face whatever came my way, no matter what it cost me. After that last job, things went downhill fast. Viper never fully recovered from his injuries, and as he got weaker, the gang started to unravel. The Bloodhounds didn't waste any time. They came at us hard, hitting our spots all over the city, trying to take back what we'd stolen from them. It was chaos. The city was turning into a battlefield, and we were right in the middle of it. We tried to hold our ground, but we were outnumbered and outgunned. The Bloodhounds were relentless, and without Viper's leadership, we were struggling to keep it together. Rex and Slim did their best to take charge, but they weren't Viper. The unity we'd had before was crumbling, and with every loss, the cracks in our foundation grew wider. The pressure was getting to everyone. Slim became more reckless, taking bigger risks that only seemed to get more of our guys killed. Rex was drinking more, his usually sharp instincts dulled by the constant stress and fear. Tank was barely holding on, trying to keep the younger members in line, but even he was starting to lose faith. And me? I was just trying to survive. I don't know how much time passed. Days, weeks, maybe months. It all started to blur together. We were constantly on the move, shifting between safe houses, trying to stay one step ahead of the Bloodhounds and the cops who were cracking down hard on the escalating violence. Sleep was a luxury none of us could afford, and every day felt like it could be our last. Viper's condition continued to deteriorate. Doc did what he could, but without proper medical care, Viper was fighting a losing battle. He was bedridden most of the time, his body wasting away, but his mind was still sharp. Even as he lay there, too weak to stand, he was still giving orders, still trying to hold us together. But we all knew it was only a matter of time before the Bloodhounds or the cops got to us, and when they did, we'd be finished. It was around this time that I started to think about getting out. I knew Viper would never allow it. He'd made it clear that the only way out of this life was in a body bag, but the idea of dying in some dirty alley or rotting away in prison didn't sit well with me. I started making plans in secret. I knew I couldn't just walk away. The Bloodhounds would hunt me down, and the gang would never forgive me for bailing. But I had to try. I started setting aside money, making contacts, trying to figure out a way to disappear, to start over somewhere far away from all of this. But before I could put my plan into action, everything fell apart. It happened one night just after midnight. We were holed up in one of our last remaining safe houses, a rundown apartment building on the edge of the city. I was on lookout staring out at the empty street below when I saw the first car pull up. It was followed by another, and then another. My heart sank as I realized what was happening. The bloodhounds had found us. I barely had time to sound the alarm before they were on us, storming the building with a level of coordination and firepower that we couldn't match. The first wave hit hard, smashing through the front door and pouring into the building like a flood. Gunfire erupted, and I could hear the shouts and screams of my comrades as they tried to fend off the attack. I grabbed my gun and joined the fight, but it was chaos. The bloodhounds were everywhere, moving through the building like a pack of wolves, cutting us down one by one. I saw Slim go down in a hail of bullets, his body crumpling to the floor, lifeless. Rex was cornered in one of the rooms, fighting like a madman, but there were too many of them. I don't know what happened to Tank. One minute he was beside me, and the next he was gone, swallowed up by the chaos. As I fought my way through the building, trying to find a way out, I knew it was over. There were too many of them, and we were out of time. But I couldn't think about that. I had to find Viper. I had to make sure he wasn't left behind. I reached Viper's room just as the bloodhounds were breaking down the door. He was lying in bed, too weak to fight, too weak to even move. I ran to his side, grabbing his gun from the nightstand and taking up a position by the door. But it was no use. The bloodhounds burst into the room, guns blazing. I fired back, but it was like trying to hold back the ocean with a bucket. They overwhelmed us, knocking me to the ground and tearing the gun from my hands. As I lay there bleeding and broken, I looked over at Viper. He was staring at me, his eyes filled with something I'd never seen before, regret. And in that moment, I realized that he knew it was over too. He'd built this gang, this life, out of nothing, but in the end, it had all come crashing down around him. The bloodhound leader, the new one, a younger guy who'd taken over after I'd killed the last one, stepped into the room. He looked down at Viper with a sneer, and then without a word, he raised his gun and shot him in the head. I wanted to scream, to cry out, but I couldn't. I was too weak, too broken. All I could do was lie there as the bloodhounds finished their work, killing everyone who was left. When they were done, they left me for dead, bleeding out on the cold, dirty floor of that abandoned building. I don't know how long I lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness. I was sure I was going to die, and maybe I should have, but somehow I survived. When I finally woke up, the bloodhounds were gone, and the building was silent. I don't know what kept me going. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was just the will to live. But I dragged myself out of that building, out of that city, and disappeared. I've been on the run ever since, living under the radar, trying to stay one step ahead of the bloodhounds and the cops. I don't know if they're still looking for me, but I can't take any chances. I've changed my name, changed my appearance, done everything I can to erase the person I used to be. But no matter how far I run, I can't escape what I've done, what I've become. The memories haunt me every day, the faces of the people I killed, the friends I lost, the life I destroyed. I thought I could handle it, that I could survive in that world, but I was wrong. So here I am, telling my story to a bunch of strangers on the internet, hoping that maybe, just maybe, someone will understand. Maybe someone will see this and think twice before they get caught up in the same life I did. But the truth is, I don't know if there's any redemption for someone like me. I made my choices, and now I have to live with them. All I can do is keep running, keep trying to survive, and hope that one day I'll find a way to make peace with the ghost of the person I used to be. Thanks for listening, Reddit. Maybe this is the closure I needed. Maybe it's just another reminder of how far I've fallen. But either way, it feels good to get it all out. Take care of yourselves and don't make the same mistakes I did.